in order to get back, this was not easy, because under the Russian system, you had to have permission to move from one place to another. You can't just decide that, oh, I'm going to buy a ticket and go somewhere. That's not the way it worked, and maybe Michael could tell you more about that, and Lana can tell you a little bit about the Russian system. This was communism. And so my dad was very good at this. He was very creative, so to speak. The train from Tashkent, that's Uzbekistan, to Moscow came through once a day. And it took 3 days, by the way, from where we were to Moscow. And so he went, but the train wouldn't stop. So he decided, so we were going to flee, we were going to leave Russia, whether the NKVD liked it or not, because they used to ask my dad, when are you becoming a Russian citizen? They used to call him in every so often. And he said, I'm not a Russian citizen, I'm a Polish citizen. And the war is over, we are going back to Poland. So again, these 4 boys all became Russian citizens, and they couldn't get out. They stayed there for a long time until some of them made it to Israel. And we met up with them later on, but this is much later. But anyway, I just want to tell you how we got. So what did Dad do? He went on a horse and buggy 50 miles back, got on the train, and bribed the conductor. And so all he asked him to do is make a stop at Stancy Alga. And sure enough, we were waiting 4 o'clock in the morning. This I'll never forget. I was already 14 years old now, see. So I remember it much better. And I remember Mother and I, my brother was in the army already. He was drafted first in the Russian army and then in the Polish army, because he was older than I am. He was already 18, and he was already 19. I was 14. So he was in the Russian army, so it was just Mother and I. We were waiting 4 o'clock in the morning at the station, and we hear the train coming, and sure enough, the train stopped. You see my dad with the locomotive, with the operator, waving at us. And sure enough, we had a small suitcase, pushed up the suitcase, he grabbed us, both Mother and I. We were inside the train. It was packed. We couldn't find a place, but he found a place where we could sit. And it took us 3 days to get to Moscow on that train. It's a good thing nobody asked us for documents or anything like that. I don't remember all this. All I remember that we are now in Moscow. In fact, I even remember seeing the Kremlin. We were on a streetcar. I remember I used to go on a streetcar. I was already 14 years old, so I was more independent. I was always independent. Even then, I used to go on the market, and I used to make cups, and I used to sell them. I learned to be a tinsmith. You ever heard of a tinsmith? No. Yeah? I used to make cups, and I used to go on the market and used to exchange it for flour. Anyway, that's how we survived those 4 years. So we are on the train, we're in Moscow, and now we don't want to stay in Moscow, we want to go back to Poland. So for the next 2 months, or maybe 3 months, again, I don't remember exactly, we were on trains, trying to get on a train back to Poland. And after about 2-3 months on the train, the same way, waking up in the middle of the night on an open car, and wet, it was raining. There's no change of clothes. You didn't have enough to change clothes. Wet, and somehow again we didn't get sick or anything, no pneumonia. We just made it back to Poland, and finally, when we got back to Poland, my brother Mark greeted us. We found him. It was not easy, but we found him. He was in the Polish army at the time, and he found a place for us to live in a place called Włocławek, but that's not important. All I'm telling you, we are back in Poland. Now, we want to go back to our town. So we make it to Lvov, as it was shown before. This is the big city in Galicia. We're not far from our home. And guess what? As soon as we arrived in Lvov, they told us, don't try to go back to your town. This is the first time I heard the word Holocaust. Actually, it was not yet. You heard the word Churban in Hebrew, Churban. That's also Yiddish, Chom, Churban. Have you come across the word Churban? Yeah, you know it, those who know Hebrew, Churban. It's a catastrophe. In fact, I wrote it down to show you how many different words were used at the time instead of Holocaust. Holocaust came much later. By that time, we called it Churban, which means an inferno or a catastrophe. It means that we found out that most of the Jews were exterminated, or were annihilated, were incinerated. Those are the words we used at the time, and until finally the word Shoah. Shoah in Hebrew and Holocaust in English. How many can define the word Holocaust? Do you know exactly what the word means, Holocaust?
Holocaust is burn. Fire.
Holocaust really means consumed by fire. That's what Holocaust means. So as I said, this later on we called it the Holocaust. And they told us you cannot go home because they will kill you. Who is they? The Ukrainians. They're the ones that took over your homes. They're the ones, most of them, they collaborated with the Nazis. And we found all this out as we came back, because when we were in Kazakhstan, we didn't know. We knew something bad was happening, but we didn't know how bad. And we got there, it was really bad, which means not one of those 100 people I told you about in my family, not one survived. Not one. Everybody was killed. And we looked, and my mother used to say, look, maybe you can recognize your uncle, you can recognize a cousin. Somebody must be alive. Somebody must be alive. And they said we couldn't go back to Bohorachane, which is the little town where I was born, because they told us, you don't go back there, because once they find out that you survived, they're going to kill you. And so we never went back to the little town, except we were very close in Lviv. And as I said, we would always ask people, those who did survive like we did, which weren't that many, you know, I could probably maybe a dozen that survived. From the 2,500 Jews living in Bohorachane, maybe a dozen survived. So when we would meet up with them, they would always tell us, nobody is alive, they all died. So you can imagine the appreciation that I have, and my mother, who didn't want to go, didn't want to leave, thought about, gee, Dad was right, you know, it was the right thing to do. We survived. But we didn't feel good about this. You know, survivors usually do not feel good about it. You know, how come I survived and my little cousin Lonka didn't survive? So you must have read that part, right? About my grandfather, who was the very first victim, because he wouldn't join the Judenrat, the Council of Jewish Elders. You read about that, right? So you know about that. So in my mind, had I been there, I would have died with my cousin, you know, my favorite cousin. We were like brothers up until we were 10 years old. So we stayed in Poland for a short time, and then we realized we are under the communist system. You know, the Russians took over that part, as you know, and we said, Dad says again, we're not staying here. We gotta take off, and we had to cross the border to Czechoslovakia, from Czechoslovakia to Austria, and in Austria they set up DP camps. You know what a DP camp is? DP? Displaced Persons Camp. And there were thousands upon thousands of Jews who did survive, got out of the concentration camps, and we all stayed in these camps. Everybody at that time wanted to go to Israel.